lots of words that one could use to describe Igor Tudor's time at Tottenham. Catastrophic, abysmal, humiliating, horrendous, cataclysmic, calamitous, awful, disgusting, shameful, abominable, shambolic, disastrous, ruinous, devastating, dire, woeful, wretched, hapless, tragic, pathetic, farcical, unsuccessful, ill-judged, reckless, feckless, stupid, and embarrassing would all be reasonable adjectives to describe the bald Croatian's time so far in North London, with the exception of that 1-1 draw at Anfield, as would inept, incompetent, clueless, ghastly, and dreadful, among others. But above all else, it has been funny. Very funny. It's easy to pick out the worst managerial stints of all time, on a points-per-game basis or in terms of expected versus actual outcome, but that is quite different to the funniest. Alan Pardew, for example, had an absolutely horrendous record at West Bromwich Albion, only winning 3 of his 21 games in charge, guarding the Baggies very safely to the foot of the Premier League table, but he didn't headbutt any opposition players on the touchline or call Manuel Pellegrini an effing old C-word like he did at Newcastle, and Roy Hodgson and David Moyes both had bitterly disappointing stints at Liverpool and Manchester United, falling far short of expectations, but they were both fairly dour and understated affairs. Not all that amusing. During Felix Magath's time at Fulham, by contrast, which spanned just 20 matches and 1 relegation, he reportedly made players do hill sprints on the Friday before a game, so they were all knackered for the match itself. He made them stand dead still in silence for an hour in their formation, and he instructed Brede Hangeland to treat his thigh injury with cheese, not by consuming it, but by rubbing it on the afflicted area. And during Diego Maradona's tumultuous 20 months in charge of Argentina, he selected a quite incredible 108 different players across just 24 matches. He suffered a humiliating 6-1 defeat against Bolivia, he ran over a cameraman's leg at the 2010 World Cup, and he taunted both Bastian Schweinsteiger and Thomas Muller, claiming to have mistaken the latter for a ball boy, before Germany proceeded to thrash his Argentina team 4-0. Elsewhere, Nathan Jones claimed that there weren't many better managers than him in Europe after he joined Southampton, where he lasted for all of 14 games and won 15 out of a possible 42 points, descending further and further into madness at each of his press conferences. 1966 World Cup winner Alan Ball is best remembered at Man City for receiving false information on the final day of the season, instructing his players to try and run the clock down, which then resulted in their relegation. And in his 17 games in charge of Celta Vigo, Ballon d'Or winning Barcelona and Bulgaria legend Hristo Stoichkov told the press and his players that he didn't believe in tactics or studying the opposition, deployed a radical 2-4-4 formation in order to illustrate his point, and promptly oversaw the club's relegation from La Liga. Even some not wholly unsuccessful managerial stints can score highly in terms of comic value. Louis van Gaal finished 4th and 5th and won the FA Cup during his 2 seasons at Manchester United, but calling Chris Smalling Mike, Queen's Park Rangers, Queen's Park Raisins, and talking about sex masochism in one of his post-match press conferences, kept the amusement levels pretty high. Hopefully you get the idea, and if not, you must be extremely thick and stupid because this really was an extensive introduction featuring some excellent honourable mentions, which was so long and comprehensive in fact that it could well get me the sack. Check out the Alfie Potts Harmer YouTube channel for longer videos, the latest of which is about why everyone hates modern football, and especially the Premier League this season, which is over 40 minutes long. I know, incredible stuff. Back with some more honourable mentions at the end of this video, if we've time, but for now, and without any further ado, who isn't funny and who I would never make any jokes at the expense of, here are 7 of the funniest managerial stints in the history of football. 7th. Ange Postecoglou, Nottingham Forest. I have to be extremely careful with what I say here, for reasons that I can't explain, but despite the masterful and unquestionable genius and judgment of the Nottingham Forest hierarchy, which should never be called into doubt by anyone, Ange Postecoglou's time at the City Ground was, I hope you'd all agree, very amusing. To start with, Ange is just a funny guy. His 2 seasons at Tottenham, in which he finished 5th and 17th, winning Tottenham's first trophy in 17 years, after confidently predicting that he always wins something in his second season, but also overseeing the club's lowest league finish in 47 years, was iconic, for both good and for bad, and I don't think that anyone expected to see him back in management in the Premier League quite so soon after leaving Spurs. Whatever you think of Ange, one thing that cannot be questioned is his commitment to his tactical ideals. For good or bad, he plays extremely aggressive, high-risk, high-pressing and attack-minded football, sometimes referred to as Ange ball, regardless of the opposition, the competition, or indeed, the quality of the players at his disposal. That is the precise opposite of Nottingham Forest, and how they played under his predecessor, Nuno Espirito Santo, who guided Forest to a tremendous 7th place finish in the Premier League last season, playing with a highly effective low block, a couple of rapid wingers and a big man in the box, who proved devastating on the counter-attack. So, of course, having spent a reported £587 million on 129 different players to play that system over the last 4 seasons, why not bring in a manager mid-season, we ought not forget, meaning that he had 0 time with his new players on the training ground, nor any transfer window in order to tweak the squad to his preferences, who is renowned for playing the most contrasting style and system conceivably imaginable, doggedly and religiously, with 0 room for compromise, and just hope for the best. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Worst case scenario, he fails to win any of his 8 league games in charge, losing 6 of them, you drop into the relegation zone, and you have supporters chant the name of his predecessor repeatedly throughout his 6 weeks at the helm. Unfortunately, the worst happened. In fairness, no one could have possibly seen it coming, except for literally everyone other than a 6th. Gary Neville, Valencia. It was almost too cliché for me to include, but at the end of the day, this was just very funny. Valencia are one of the biggest football clubs in Spain, who can list the likes of Gus Hiddink, Claudio Ranieri, and Rafa Benitez among their former illustrious head coaches. Naturally, therefore, midway through the 2015-16 season, with the club all the way down in 8th place in the La Liga table, it made perfect sense to sack Nuno Espirito Santo, that man again, and bring in Gary Neville. After all, Neville had never worked in senior management before, his time as Roy Hodgson's assistant with England was going swimmingly, and he couldn't speak a word of Spanish. For some reason, Valencia fans weren't happy with his appointment. Ungrateful bastards. In fairness, Neville had a burgeoning reputation as a pundit on Sky Sports, which a lot of people felt could translate into success in management. They were wrong. Translating it into Spanish was hard enough, let alone into success in management.
Am I tough enough? Tough enough? Hell yes, I'm tough enough.
To make matters funnier, Gary's brother Phil was already at Valencia working as a coach, but he was overlooked for the top job in favour of Gary, further cementing his reputation as the B-Tech brother following their playing days. Poor Phil. He was at least promoted to assistant. All of this, it should be noted, came as the result of the Nevilles' relationship with controversial Valencia owner Peter Lim, who is despised by many Valencia supporters, not just because he hired Gary Neville, who accuse him of having run the club into the ground. Lim had recently acquired a 50% stake in Salford City, co-owned by the Nevilles and fellow Class of 92 alumni, Paul Scholes, Nicky Butt and Ryan Giggs, alongside other joint business ventures. It turns out, though, hiring someone because you're invested in hotel and property projects alongside them, and they're good on Monday Night Football, isn't a recipe for success in what was then, arguably, the best league in Europe. Who knew? Ginev spent just under 4 months, by his own admission, shouting concentracion at his players because it was the only Spanish word that he knew, and feeling woefully out of his depth, before his business partner, finally put him out of his misery. Neville's record at the Mestalla wasn't as abysmal as some people imagine, as he won 10, drew 7 and lost 11 of his 28 games in charge, as the team fell from 8th to 11th place in the La Liga table. But that run included an infamous 7-0 defeat against Barcelona, and his broken Spanish made him, and Valencia by extension, a figure of ridicule in the Spanish press. It was such a painful experience that Neville never worked in management again, but the important thing to remember, as a very wise man once said, is that failure is a bruise, not a tattoo. 5th, Michael Knighton, Carlisle United. Michael Knighton could have been known as the man who owned Manchester United. The son of a banker whose academy career in football was ended by injuries, Knighton was offered a controlling 50.06% stake in the club by Manchester United chairman Martin Edwards for £10 million in 1989, and the whole club for £20 million. The deal was agreed, the contract was signed, and Knighton was even paraded around the pitch at Old Trafford in a full Manchester United training kit, like some sort of new signing, before a game against Arsenal. However, in mid-September, Knighton's business partners Bob Thornton and Stanley Cohen pulled out of the deal. Knighton sought alternative funding from Rangers and Blackpool owners David Murray and Owen Oyston, the latter of whom is a convicted sex offender. Knighton was able to provide Edwards with proof of funds, but at the 11th hour, under intense pressure from senior figures at Old Trafford, he reneged on his bid to acquire a controlling stake in the club, settling for a seat on the club's board. Today, Knighton's unrealised 50% stake in Manchester United would be worth over $3 billion, and the club as a whole, which he was offered for £20 million, is now valued at north of $6.5 billion. Instead, though, he is best known as being one of the wackiest Football League chairmen in an era which wasn't exactly lacking in them. 3 years after his aborted takeover bid at Old Trafford, Knighton gave up his seat on the Manchester United board in order to buy out Carlisle United. The Cumbrians were bottom of the entire Football League at the time, but Knighton outlined his ambition to return the club to the top flight for the first time since the 1970s. Carlisle were promoted in 1995, relegated in 1996, and promoted again in 1997. After a difficult start to the 1997-98 season, though, Knighton controversially sacked manager Mervyn Day and replaced him with, with himself. You know what they say, if you want a job doing right, do it yourself. In a shocking turn of events, though, Knighton's role as owner-manager wasn't a roaring success, Carlisle were relegated, and he was nicknamed the most reviled man in Cumbria. It goes hard as a nickname, if we're being honest. He stayed on for another 7 months, who was going to sack him, before replacing himself with Nigel Pearson. Are you an ostrich? A late goal by on-loan goalkeeper Jimmy Glass very famously kept Carlisle in the Football League at the end of the 1998-99 season, but Carlisle entered administration and Knighton departed in 2002. A 2021 profile by the BBC described Knighton as a recluse now, who had rejected football for his second passion of art. But just a year later, he unveiled plans for a second Manchester United takeover attempt, over 30 years after the first. Knighton, described at the time as having an estimated net worth of £5.8 million, branded the Glazers as useless, and said that he was working on a hostile bid to buy the club. Obviously, that didn't happen. But it would have been funny to see either Erik ten Hag or Ruben Amorim sacked, and replaced by a 74-year-old sculptor who once claimed that he and his wife had seen a UFO, and that he had received a telepathic message telling him, "Don't be afraid, Michael." Cumbria's News and Star newspaper subsequently ran the headline, "Knighton, aliens spoke to me." Humiliated, Knighton threatened to sue the paper and leave Carlisle, to which Carlisle supporters, presumably, said yes please. 4th, Kevin Cullis, Swansea City. Younger football fans could be forgiven for assuming that Bob Bradley was the funniest Swansea City appointment, the American being mocked mercilessly and nicknamed Brad Bobley during his less than 3 months and just 11 games in South Wales. But in reality, he doesn't even come close. Unlike Bob Bradley, who had extensive experience managing in the US, Norway and France before joining the Swans, 1996 Swansea City appointment Kevin Cullis had never managed a club before, and in fact, he'd never even been involved in professional football in any capacity. Cullis was a 37-year-old civil engineer by trade, who previously managed a nightclub, and whose only relevant experience had been running the amateur non-league club Cradley Town of the West Midlands League Premier Division, where he coached the club's under-16s on a Sunday morning. That was considered sufficient for Swansea to appoint Cullis in February 1996, as the club sat second from bottom in the third division, fighting for their lives. Swansea were already in crisis. Longtime head coach Frank Burrows had resigned in the summer of 1995, with backroom staff Bobby Smith and Jimmy Rimmer taking caretaker charge of the club. As Swansea battled relegation, chairman Doug Sharp announced that he had done a deal to sell the club to a multi-millionaire named Michael Thompson from the West Midlands. Thompson outlined his modest ambition to take Swansea from the foot of the third division table to the Premier League in just 5 years, and he had just the managerial dream team required to complete the job. It was Kevin Cullis, a man who no one knew anything about and who seemingly knew nothing about professional football, and Paul Molesworth, who had previously been Liverpool's head of scouting in the Midlands area, but who also had zero coaching or managerial experience. Again, you're not quite going to believe this, but things didn't work out. The author of Swansea's programme notes accidentally called Kevin Cullis Keith ahead of his opening game, illustrating just how unknown he was. Cullis is reported to have made grandiose promises to Swansea players in terms of contracts and bonuses, despite the club being in financial disarray, and by his second game in charge, it is reported that players completely ignored him during his half-time team talk, considering him to be clueless, and instead just talked among themselves, led by Christian Edwards, about how to approach the second half. Cullis resigned after 6 days and 2 matches, with a win percentage of 0%. To make matters worse, Michael Thompson, the supposed multi-millionaire promising Premier League promotion who brought Cullis to the club, later aborted his bid to buy Swansea, claiming that one of his backers, who was offering up £150,000 of funding, had pulled out of the deal. Cullis threatened to sue Swansea, and he was later jailed, twice, in 2003 and 2004, for 9 months apiece, for fraud and deception, and for handling a stolen insurance certificate and using it with intent to deceive. Swansea replaced him with Liverpool and Denmark legend Jan Molby. Third, Troy Deeney, Forest Green Rovers. It says a lot about Troy Deeney's management of Forest Green Rovers that it was funnier and stupider, in my view, than Swansea appointing a guy who had literally never worked in professional football ever before, who was ignored during his half-time team talk, and was then convicted of fraud. But it was. The most batshit banter-era managerial stint of all time, Deeney's spell in Gloucestershire was comical and farcical from start to finish. It began, according to eco-friendly Forest Green Rovers owner Dale Vince, with him only discovering, after he'd sacked manager David Horseman, that he was contractually obliged to offer Deeney a job as head coach. Still playing for Forest Green at the time, Deeney was only 35 years old, but Vince claims that his director of football had offered Deeney first refusal when the top job at the club became available without consulting him. Thankfully, despite that minor mix-up, things worked out brilliantly. Deeney, who is renowned for his modest estimation of his own abilities and for never ever embellishing stories on some of Britain's most loved podcasts and radio shows, failed to win any of his 6 games in charge, as Forest Green fell from second to bottom to dead last, and he was dismissed after less than a month. That's not even the funny bit. The amusing part was Deeney laying into his players like he was still a pound shop pundit on TalkSport, rather than their actual manager, calling them every name under the sun in post-match press conferences, throwing Fankati Dabo especially under the bus, and claiming that he would rather watch Antiques Roadshow than his own team. It seemed as though Deeney was firing shots in every which direction, rather than accepting any blame or accountability himself. If you can believe such a thing. His journey in management hit an early obstacle, which is ironic and unfortunate for someone with a famous aversion to speed bumps, But the real journey was the laughs that we had along the way. Except for Forest Green Rovers fans. They were relegated. Second, Joe Kinnear, Newcastle United. Very unlike Troy Deeney, you have to respect what the late Joe Kinnear did in management, especially at Wimbledon, where he finished 6th in the Premier League table and reached the semi-finals of both domestic cup competitions. Nonetheless, his time at Newcastle was a prime example of jester-maxing, in which he completely banter-mogged several players at St James's Park. Club legend Kevin Keegan had resigned as Newcastle boss at the beginning of the 2008-09 season, following a fallout with the club's ownership, with Kinnear appointed as his surprise replacement. It came as a surprise, because Kinnear had been out of management for 4 whole years, and in his last job, he had been sacked by Nottingham Forest halfway through a season, in which the Trees were relegated from the Championship down to League One. What he lacked in recent experience or success, though, Kinnear more than made up for in aggression. He called journalist Simon Bird a cunt in an early interview, in which he swore more than 50 times in the space of 5 minutes. It's impressive stuff. At the end of the interview, he declared that he would no longer be speaking to the media at Newcastle, delegating that task to his assistant Chris Hughton instead. Kinnear had zero doubts about his own abilities, though, claiming to have played over 400 games as a player for Tottenham, when he actually played 258, to have signed Dean Holdsworth for just £50,000, when the widely reported figure was actually £720,000, and he said that he had been named as the Manager of the Year 3 times. It was actually once, by the LMA in 1994, but who cares about minor details like that? He also came up with some interesting new names for Newcastle's players. Hatem Ben Arfa became Ben Afri, Shola Amiobi was rebranded as Shola Amamobi, Jonas Gutierrez was upgraded to Galtieres, Charles Nzogbia, unfortunately for him, became Charles Insomnia, and most amusingly of all, Johan Kabai's name was famously updated by Kinnear to Johan Kebab. Hey, an attempt was made. The same cannot be said about Newcastle in several of their games under Kinnear. Kebab and co. were only able to win 4 of his 18 matches in charge before he resigned for medical reasons, and Newcastle would go on to be relegated under club legend Alan Shearer. First, Claude Anelka, Wraith Rovers. The stupidest, funniest, and most ridiculous managerial stint of all time, without exception, is Claude Anelka's 8 games in charge of Wraith Rovers. If the name sounds somewhat familiar, then you are probably aware of Nicolas Anelka, the former Arsenal and Chelsea star, who won 69 caps for France. Claude is Nicolas's older brother, 9 years his senior, who had a very modest career in France's lower leagues before retiring from the sport at the age of only 28. A couple of years later, he became his brother's agent, purely by virtue of his impeccable CV, in a very much meritocratic recruitment process, alongside his work as a DJ in a nightclub. Claude was kept busy over the years. Nicolas famously didn't like to stick around anywhere for too long, and in 2004, he invested some of his considerable earnings, for obvious reasons, in Scottish second-tier outfit Wraith Rovers. Claude invested a reported £300,000 in Rovers, and in return, all the club had to do was appoint him as their manager and director of football. I mean, given his vast experience within the game, and in nightclubs, just the one of those 2 roles clearly wouldn't suffice. Again, what could possibly go wrong? Well, whilst Nicolas banged in goals for Man City, Claude cacked his pants, metaphorically speaking, in Fife, though possibly literally 2, we've really no way of knowing that, have we? Losing 7 and drawing 1 of his 8 games in charge, before the club's director of football gave him the chop. That was also him, of course, so that must have been a very awkward conversation. Claude signed a bunch of unknown amateur and semi-professional footballers from France to Starks Park, presumably just assuming that the Scottish First Division would be a cakewalk, some of whom, reportedly, had never even played 11-a-side football before. Which, again, is very funny. The dressing room turned toxic, for obvious reasons, with divides between the domestic and continental players, and those who had and hadn't played 11-a-side football before rapidly emerging. In fairness, they were basically the same two groups. From only narrowly surviving the previous season, Wraith were relegated with a pathetic 16 points to their name, following only 3 wins all season, which left them an enormous 30 points from safety. Those are the kinds of numbers that you expect following a points deduction, not a £300,000 cash injection from a world-class football agent and nightclub DJ. Claude departed for good after just 5 months, later conceding that he didn't have a plan when he joined the club. You don't say, Claude. That is it for today's video, though extremely honourable mentions go to Brian Clough at Leeds United, Tony Adams at Granada, Steve Keane at Blackburn Rovers, Terry Connor at Wolves, Frank de Boer at Crystal Palace, Dave Hockaday and Steve Evans at Leeds United, and Jim Fallon at Dumbarton, alongside many, many, many others that I either haven't mentioned or no doubt just missed, but I hope that you at least enjoyed the 7 who featured. That is it for today's video, but hit the like button if you enjoyed it. As I say, I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, but also my second or personal channel where you can still find longer videos of mine, known as Alfie Potts Armour. I got the name from, well, it's my name, that's where I got it from. Yeah, not the most original, but, it's good. Check that out. You can also find me on various social media platforms, typically via the username at HITC Sevens, should you wish to do so. And you can now support my work and my journalistic independence further, which is to say financially, should you wish to do so, either by heading to the Alfie Potts Armour YouTube channel, where you can now become a channel member, or by going to buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potts Armour, where you can do the exact same thing, but Google won't keep 30% of it for themselves. That is it from me, but I hope to see you all very shortly, either here, there, or everywhere. Please take care out there until then. I love you all very much. Cheers.